As some of you may know, we are in the middle of a series on the Gospel of John, and the primary question that we're asking is, how do we receive joy? And at this point in our series, we find ourselves getting close to the end in John chapter 13. And in John chapter 13, we begin to read about Jesus' farewell meal. Unlike in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper happened before the Jewish Passover on what was known as the Day of Preparation. And Jesus knew that his time on earth was coming to an end, and he wanted to show his disciples the full extent of his love. This long scene in the larger story of Jesus begins with John chapter 13 and continues all the way through to John chapter 17, which means that these chapters should be read together as a single unit. The most memorable thing that happens is that Jesus washes the disciples' feet, which is followed by a long conversation reiterating key themes of his teaching and saying his final goodbyes to his best friends. At the end, Jesus offers a prayer asking God to make his mission in the world successful through the love and unity of his disciples. And this morning, I want to focus on the foot washing in chapter 13, verses 3 to 17. And I also want to focus on the main reason why Jesus does this, which we find in chapter 17. There are Bibles in front of you, and these key scripture verses will also be projected on the worship screen, but I would encourage you to follow along as we kind of hit different parts of this story. From the very start, beginning with chapter 13, verse 1, Jesus tells us that he's going to wash the disciples' feet to show them the full extent of his love. And so this is what we read, and this will be projected on the screen. We read, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wash them with the towel that was tied around him. And these verses are familiar to us, and so we often miss how astonishing they really are. Just think about this. Jesus, whom the disciples thought was the Jewish Messiah, whom the disciples thought was the Son of God, and therefore the most important person on planet Earth, did something that only a slave or a servant would do: wash the nasty feet of the dinner guests. And this is clearly an example of self-giving love, of humble service. And note that this action was a choice that Jesus made from a position of strength. He was not forced into this menial work, nor was it expected of him. He was not driven by weakness. It's not like he had low self-esteem that compelled him to gain the approval of his disciples. Rather, the Bible says that Jesus intentionally, purposefully chose this act of humble service as an expression of divine love. It's almost like he was saying, if you want to understand the love of the God that I call Father, watch this. And he was empowered to make this choice because he knew that he came from God and that he was returning to God. He was confident in his own identity, and this gave him the power and the strength to intentionally choose humble service, teaching us that true humility has nothing to do with low status or being a doormat, but an attitude that only the strong can truly embrace. And then the story progresses. Jesus comes to Simon Peter, who says, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean, and you are clean." Now, sometimes we're a little too hard on Peter, right? Jesus says, "I'm going to wash your feet," and Peter says, "You're never going to wash my feet." And sometimes we think, "Come on, Peter, what's the big deal? Just let him wash your feet." Because, again, this passage has become so familiar to us. But I want you to think about this. How would you feel if a man that you deeply respected and admired, an authority figure, stripped down to his underwear, knelt down in front of you, grabbed your feet, and started washing? Now, I don't know about you, but that would kind of freak me out. I don't like to hang out with guys in their underwear. And I typically don't like people touching my feet. So like Peter, I probably would have said, "Come on, Jesus, don't be weird. We don't really have to do this, right?" But this part of the story is instructive because in addition to teaching us about the importance of humble giving, it also teaches us about the challenges of humble receiving. Have you ever noticed that sometimes it's harder to receive a gift than it is to give one? If you've had that experience, say amen. How many times have people offered to pay for your meal and you say, "Oh, no, that's okay. I got this," right? Or do you remember a time when someone gave you a very thoughtful and expensive gift and you said something like, "I can't accept this, it's just too much"? It's often really hard to receive a generous gift because it creates what we call a debt of gratitude. And the debt of gratitude makes us vulnerable. So in certain respects, it takes real humility to receive a gift properly, gracefully, especially when the gift that the other person is giving is themselves in humble service to you. It's almost like someone would be compelled to say, "Get off your knees. You don't really need to do this for me. It just makes me uncomfortable." Have you ever noticed how sometimes when we give a gift, it shifts the power dynamics in a relationship? And we often feel like we have to give an equal return gift in order to balance the scales because we don't like being indebted to people. But nevertheless, Jesus says, if you want to be one of my disciples, you not only have to give humbly of yourself, but you also have to be willing to receive humbly from others. And this is hard. But when we put both of these things together, we see what Jesus is trying to teach us in his final moments on earth. And as we've mentioned before, when people wait until the very end and they say, "There's one more thing I want to tell you before I die," it's usually pretty important, right? And what Jesus is doing is he's teaching us the importance of humble giving and receiving. He's teaching us how to love one another and the importance of that love in the eyes of a watching world. He is setting an example for them. And so listen to what he says in chapter 13, verses 12 to 17. After he washed their feet, had put on his robe, and returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord." And I want to point out here that the term Lord during this time under Roman rule meant Caesar. The disciples believed that Jesus was Lord, not Caesar. The disciples proclaimed Jesus as Lord, not Caesar. And Jesus says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. You will receive joy if you do them. So, Jesus is not simply washing their feet as an expression of His love for them, but also to set an example of how they should love each other through concrete acts of humble service. Not just saying, I love you, not just sending a card, not just patting them on the back, but in concrete, specific acts, not only of service, but of humble service. This is the way to a life of blessing and joy, which is the path of humble giving and receiving. And so Jesus is calling us to surrender our ego and all of the selfishness that flows through it so that we can truly enjoy relationships that are structured by reciprocal love and mutual self-donation. And then Jesus goes on towards the end of this section to explain why this is so important. In his prayer at the end of the story in chapter 17, he says that humble giving and receiving is what is required for the disciples to be unified. Somebody say unified. Say it again. Unified. Unity is what is important here. Humble giving and receiving is what is required for the disciples to be unified in love. And that unity will be the source of their credibility in the world, without which they cannot continue advancing the mission of Jesus after He has returned to the Father. And so listen to what Jesus says in His final prayer in John 17, beginning with verse 21. He says, "As you, Father, are in me, and I am in you, may they," referring to all of His disciples, "also be in us. So that," read this part with me, "so that the world may believe that you sent me." You see what's going on here? The glory, somebody say glory. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, so that they may be one as we are one. Read this next verse with me. I in them and you in me, that they may become completely, say completely one. So that, here's the purpose, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. The world, you see the shift there? He started talking about the disciples, right? So that the disciples may be completely one. Then he shifts so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them, referring to the whole world, even as you have loved me. My friends, this is absolutely astonishing when we understand what Jesus is doing here. Although it appears on the surface to be the exact opposite. In washing the disciples' feet, Jesus shares His glory with them. And this glory is self-sacrificial love. That is what the glory is all about. It's not about top-down power. It's not about violence. It's not about privilege. It's not about getting your own way. It's not about being in control. It's not about wealth or status. It's not about being admired by those in the popular crowd. It's not about effectively throwing your weight around. That's not what the glory is all about. That's what the world tells you glory is all about. And in doing this, they have turned glory into a horror show. To the contrary, the glory that God gives to Jesus and the glory that Jesus gives to us is, somebody say is, it is self-sacrificial love that finds its natural expression in acts of humble service. This glory is a love that is willing to suffer for the good of another. And this is why in the Gospel of John, from start to finish, when Jesus talks about His glory, He's pointing us to the cross. He's pointing us to the place where self-sacrificial love and humble service come together in a way that cost Him His very life. And as Jesus continues to pray, we see the deep reason for self-sacrificial love, for this particular kind of glory, and it is so they may be completely one. And when the disciples, when the church is completely unified, then the world knows that God really did send Jesus to save the world. According to Jesus, if the church is divided, then it loses its credibility and the world suffers in the absence of a reliable witness to the truth. Our unity is an outward and visible sign of the truth of the gospel, and our division undermines and eclipses this truth. And so, we're often hard on people outside of the church. Say, why don't you go to church more often? If you don't go to church, you must be a heathen. We got to convert you. Right? We're often hard on people outside of the church, but have we ever considered that one of the biggest reasons why there are so many people who are suspicious or even averse to the church is because the church has failed to give a faithful witness by remaining in various kinds of conflict and division? Is it possible that people look at the way that we treat each other, the way that we behave toward each other, and say, those people aren't very nice to each other, so why would I want to have anything to do with that? Now, I want you to be inconspicuous, but look around. Just look around. And I want you to ask yourself the question, have I ever publicly, which means to another person, have I ever publicly spoken negatively, disparagingly about someone in this room? Did you ever get upset, instead of going to that person and talking to them, did you go to somebody else and say, let me tell you what so-and-so did. Let me tell you what I don't like. Let me tell you about this decision that upset me. Because when we do that, and people who aren't in the church overhear what we're saying, do you think that draws them to our cause? So it is important for us to be unified, not only for our own sakes, but for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Jesus' mission in this world, and every person beyond these walls who desperately needs to hear good news. And while it is ultimately God who gives us unity, we open ourselves to receiving this gift by offering ourselves in humble service. Do you want God's glory? Church, do you want God's glory? You have to serve. Do you want God's joy? You have to serve. And you have to serve in humility. But how often Do we start with the assumption, the church exists to serve me? Assuming the role of a customer who is entitled to be served and provided with desired goods and services, we get lost in a series of selfish questions. Do the service times fit my schedule? Did they play the songs that I liked? Did they hit the right notes? Was the volume comfortable? Were there any distractions as they plugged their guitars in? Did the sermon make me feel good? Did Pastor Mark connect with my experience and inspire me? And it's not that these kinds of questions are bad in and of themselves. These are the kind of questions that we ask in our staff meetings every single week to provide the highest quality ministries that we possibly can. But when we evaluate the church from the mentality, I am the customer and the customer's always right, then we cannot get along and be unified. Because as soon as I please you, I have disappointed someone else. There's no way on God's green earth that 200 people are going to be able to get along and be unified, which is roughly the membership of our church, if each of us comes with the assumption that I am the customer and the customer is always right. What have you done for me lately? What are the religious goods that you offer that I desire to consume? And are they satisfying me? No. The only way that we can be truly unified is to be laser focused on Jesus and His mission. This is not in my notes, and one of my growing edges is getting off script and going long. I promise not to do this for a long time. But, you know, as a pastor, I get all kinds of feedback. And sometimes I wonder to myself, man, I've been there for 2.5 years. Is anybody listening to me? I look around at what our Christian brothers and sisters are enduring in Syria, in Iran. I look at what some of our Christian brothers and sisters that are less fortunate and marginalized and oppressed have to endure in this country. And I think to myself, does it really matter if the coffee's not hot enough? If we want to be unified, we have to be laser focused on why the church exists to begin with. And that is to serve the mission of Jesus Christ. Period. Full stop. Nothing else matters. That's how we're unified, my friends. We have to be laser focused on becoming the people that God is calling us to be. And my friends, we need each other to do that. So if we can't get along with our brothers and sisters in the church, where are we going to find the support that we need to take our next steps? And we have to be laser focused on being the people that God has called us to be by modeling, somebody say modeling self-sacrificial love through humble service in all of our relationships. And by the way, if you want to be united in your marriage, humble service. If you want to be united with your kids, humble service. If you want to be united with your friends, humble service. As we love each other through reciprocal, humble service. And it has to be reciprocal. If you're the one doing all the humble service and the other person is doing all the receiving, then something needs to happen there, right? But when it's mutual, when it's reciprocal, This is how we receive the glory of God. Do you hear me, church? We can't have the glory without the humble service, because it's precisely in these reciprocal relationships of humble service that God's glory and joy and peace, that's how it's manifest. That's how it becomes available to us. And then when we receive it, it changes us forever. This is how we receive the glory of God in the gift of unity, both of which allow us to be a faithful witness in the eyes of a watching world. And so my challenge this morning, as the band comes forward, my challenge this morning is to try to get beyond the attitude, how can the church better serve me? And start asking, how can I better serve the mission of Jesus by giving myself in humble service and self-sacrificial love? My friends, this is where we will find our unity. This is where we will find our credibility. This is where we will encounter love divine, all loves excelling. Indeed, this is where we will find lasting joy.